I'm thrilled to introduce our third speaker, Dr. Laura DeThorne.
Well, thank you so much for having me. This is going to partially be an introduction because I'm new to this group. I'm new to NIU. I'm new to DeKalb. So a lot of new here, and so thank you for including me in your group. Also asking me to speak for 15 minutes about neurodiversity is a little like asking me to eat one chocolate peanut butter M&M. I don't know if I have the willpower. Who am I? I told you that I'm new. I'm a speech pathologist by training, so I've got some fellow SLPs in the room. I asked some of my families, do you have any photos of me as an SLP? And this is the one that came back. I'd like to think it means that I'm a rock star, but I really think it just means I was always a little bit outside the box and quirky. I also have an academic hat that relates to this topic. I'm currently here as an interim chair of the School of Allied Health and Communicative Disorders, and I've been in academia now for over 2 decades. It's so weird to say that. And I've been studying autism and communicative competence for the last 10 to 15 years, in part because of this third hat, which is my parent hat. So I have 2 sons now that are both grown. Those of you that have seen them, they are taller than me, taller than my husband. They're about like 6'2". This is when my youngest was more in early adolescence, and he was diagnosed with autism when he was about 4, I guess. And that largely shaped my trajectory as a researcher. But a little story about my son. So this was probably when he was in grade school, and we were sitting on the dining room table, and I must have been snapping my fingers to some sort of song or other, probably one that's in my head, knowing me. And Zach at that time, he had words and he had speech, but not for long enough that I took it for granted. And he came out to me and he said, "Stop your singing fingers." And it took me a second, right, to figure out what he was talking about. What was he trying to tell me? Stop snapping! Stop snapping, right? And when I figured it out, I thought that was so creative and beautifully poetic. And I was sharing the story with a fellow speech pathologist because that's what we do. And she goes, "Oh, yeah, that makes sense because of his vocabulary deficit and his word finding problems," right? That completely deflated me as a parent, right? What I saw is this creative use of language. She was seeing through a deficit-based lens. And that's part of the reason I incorporated this anecdote in today's title, because it really sets the stage for what I'm going to be talking about. How these 2 sides of the coin, these 2 potential truths can coexist, and that we can have the power or the flexibility to alternate between them as serves us, as clinicians, as educators, as parents, as family members. And that's what I hope is the one thing that you walk away with today, if nothing else. So like I said, I received my PhD many, many years ago, back in 2002. My focus was on child language impairment, so really that medicalized, pathology-based lens. I spent a lot of time with Dr. Ruth Watkins studying past tense acquisition in young children. She was a fantastic mentor. I had a great funded education there through an interdisciplinary grant with special education, and so I probably learned more about autism than most at the time. However, like most programs at the time, and probably still, believe it or not, my training on autism and really child communication in general was seen through a very medicalized, pathologized lens and had very little to no first-person perspectives from the communities being studied. For me, that became very hard to reconcile that training that I had with my lived experience as a parent. So this is Zach when he was born. My husband had bought me the Superman t-shirt there for when I was giving birth. And this is both my sons at Zach's first birthday. And it was about that age at 12 months. Up there, his developmental milestones were much like you would expect from a textbook or your training program. But at that point, the words that started to come out of his mouth weren't sticking, is how I would put it. So I still remember his first word. It was cow. It was an ASHA convention, and there was this statue of a cow outside the elevator, and I still remember he pointed and went, "Ow!" And I thought, oh, that was unusual. And then when we walked by it again, he went, "Ow!" And I thought, I think we have a first word, right? But then I didn't hear it again for the longest of times. And other words would pop up and go away like that. And so my little speech pathologist bells were ringing, and I'm like, we've got some kind of atypical trajectory here. And I wasn't sure if it was apraxia of speech, if it was autism. At that time, and largely still today, people see them as mutually exclusive. We now know that they probably are much more co-occurring than we think. And so it was very hard for me to reconcile my experience with my son, who was very sweet, very affectionate, very communicative, very caring of other people, with this narrative of what I'd been taught about what autism was. So I either knew he wasn't autistic, or much of what I'd learned about autism was wrong. Well, I'm here to tell you today, I think it was largely the second. And my son now, who is 21, has largely embraced his autistic identity. So what I'm really grateful for at that time is the influence of autistic voices. Largely at that time, this would have been back in the early 2000s, mostly I was able to gather and hear these voices online. So just a snippet of some of the really influential voices. Jim Sinclair has an essay. He identifies as autistic, and it's called Don't Mourn for Us. And it's an essay to parents saying you don't need to mourn us for being autistic. Ibby Grace had an Ask an Autistic blog site that I also found tremendously empathic and influential in my journey, and it allowed me to see both my son's autism and my son's caring, loving nature, communicative nature. Fortunately, I started to see this in the professional literature thanks to the social sciences about 2010. There were two really influential special issues that came out at that time. One was Rethinking Autism and Anthropology, and another one came out in Disability Studies, which specifically was talking about neurodiversity, quality of life, and autistic adults. And all this helped me to reconcile a new identity, a new path, a new knowledge, and I felt compelled to bring that lens to our literature in speech-language pathology. Of course, these autistic voices were really solidified through the neurodiversity movement. It emerged actually in the 1990s. So that's quite some time ago now, right? It was a grassroots effort, like many civil rights efforts, that was really fueled by this history, and I would say continuing, silencing, mistreatment, institutionalization, harm, stigma, all of the negative things that we know historically marginalized and excluded communities experience. It coincided with the development of an autistic culture that really bloomed also at the boom of the internet and allowed autistic voices to connect with one another asynchronously, which is often a strength in autistic communication, and come together and really lead this movement. And I love this meme here that I pulled from Autistic Bride, because oftentimes people, I think, get frustrated with autistic advocates because they can be loud, they can have strong voices and opinions and be pretty direct. One of the things I love about the autistic community, and some people can get very hurt by that, but what I always try to remember is the root of this is them trying to protect others from the harm that they felt like they experienced. Okay, so what is neurodiversity? So at its heart, sounds like most of you know this already, but I spent a lot of time on this graphic, so I had to put the slide in, right? Just like our bodies are all different, and height and weight and skin color and hair texture and all of the things, right? So too are our brains different, and they're different in how they function. And that is just a naturally occurring aspect of humanity. That's really at its core all that neurodiversity is. But there are some basic tenets of the neurodiversity movement. There's more, but I'm going to pull 5 key ones here. And this was a study that I conducted early on, so you can see what was published in 2019. But do you know, by the way, when the first substantive use of the term neurodiversity came into our CSD literature, so speech pathology literature? Didn't make it into our literature in CSD until 2017. Right? So at that point, my son was 15 years old before that term substantively even made it into our literature. I mention that because the study came about because I was on dissertation committees, like some of yours and some of you, and it was often with my colleagues in special education studying autism, and they would be taking a very, which was common at the time, medicalized lens, right? And because I had all this new knowledge and I was learning from autistic folks, I would bring this different perspective to say, this is what I'm learning, this is what I'm hearing. And I was told multiple times, right, that's not evidence-based. That's anecdotal, right? Well, I got pretty frustrated by that. First of all, because I do think first-person accounts count as part of our evidence-based processes, first of all. But I talked with my PhD student at the time, Henry Angulo, and I said, let's start to bring then autistic voices into the published literature. And so we did qualitative analysis, like some of you, of YouTube videos that were published by individuals who identified as autistic, and they were talking about their experience of autism. And from that, we culled what are some of the key factors that differentiate a medical view of autism from more of a neurodiverse perspective of autism. And here are some of the key differences we found. One is neurodiversity challenges this concept of a normal brain, right? So what my son loves to say in our house all the time, without the filter I'm doing here, but is what the F is normal anyway, right? So that's just one of the everyday sayings in our house, right? Challenging this idea of normality. So much so it bothers me now in our research literature you'll read, and group studies will often have either a group of children with language impairment or autistic or what have you, and what do they call the control group oftentimes? Normal or typical is a little more like PC version of that, right? And I always think, how? Like typical or normal? How? You show me. I don't know how many parents we have in the room. You show me the normal child. Right? Everybody's got something. I think what researchers mean is they're not autistic or they don't have language impairment or whatever. So if I'm going to review one of your papers, that's one of the things I'm going to ask. Say what you mean, right? So if you mean they're not autistic, then say they're not autistic or what have you. So what the heck is normal anyway? It also views neurodivergence, like autism, as inherently neutral or positive. Right? And that doesn't mean it isn't oftentimes disabling. I think most in the neurodiversity movement often will claim the view of disability or disabled. Not all. There's some divergence there. This association with identity first language, much like many other diversity-based groups. For example, I've never ever in my life, to my knowledge, been called a person with womanness. Ever. I would think that were really weird if someone were to call me a person with womanness. Why? Because it's seen as an accepted, largely non-stigmatized, I'm feeling a bit different about that today, identity, right? And so people don't hesitate to use identity first language. Another tenet of the neurodiversity paradigm is appreciating autistic people as experts on their own experience and autism from their perspective, which is pretty key. And then the last one I'm going to spend the most time on is viewing the environment as disabling. Right? So in our field of CSD, this field that I have come to love and been trained in, we're trained to identify deficits in the individual. That's what we're trained to do, right? And oftentimes we ignore this broader context that people's traits are within. So back to the story of the singing fingers, right? I think you already have the point here. It's really the framework of the neurodiversity paradigm that allowed me to see the creativity in the singing fingers, right? And it was that medicalized traditional model that made my colleagues see it through this deficit-based lens. The larger part of the last 10, 15 years of my career has been, instead of studying, kids' individual variation and use of past tense, right? Not that there isn't a place for that. But I really switched into looking at what factors shape that child or that individual's ability to be a successful communicator, or what shapes how that use of past tense, whether it's a cultural difference or a language impairment, how that's viewed, right? And so I think many of our other presenters are going to be familiar with this kind of multi-circle model of the environment when we start by thinking about cultural factors, right? What are the norms and who gets to set the norms? Like, who decided that direct eye contact should be a thing, right? That's a weird thing that we expect, and that varies a lot through cultures, right? Probably don't have to tell this group that, right? How much expectations about eye contact can differ. Direct versus indirect messaging. Although I am non-autistic, I tend to be fairly direct for a white woman. That doesn't always get perceived well by people, right? So again, who gets to set these norms and for whom and why? The ableist language and messaging we use. We like to use cuss words in my house, if you haven't figured that out already. But a lot of the slurs and cuss words we use, if you think about it, poke fun or pull on historical marginalization of other communities, right? So my challenge for my kids is growing up is you're welcome to use cuss words, but they can't in any way be derogatory to a historically marginalized community. That is your challenge, right? So because so many of them are, we say things like, just today I was writing to a student and I said, oh, we have to make sure we change this manuscript for blind review. And then I had to stop and go, how else do I put that, right? Why am I drawing on this analogy? When we criticize our political opponents, we tend to say things like idiot, stupid, right? These slurs that are really tied to historically disabled communities, right? So again, there's these constant messages. I'm always getting Facebook ads and things about this epidemic of autism, right? Just framing it as an epidemic and something we need to have lawsuits about or not get vaccinated because of is all sending me a message, sending my son a message that it is not okay to be autistic, right? That's the world that we swim in. Structurally, we have things like IEPs and EDCs in the schools, right, that are really focused on individual deficits. We have segregated classrooms. But I remember when my autistic son was learning about racism in school, and he came to me and said, so why is segregation illegal for black people but not for disabled people? He was in a segregated classroom based on his disability status. How do I answer that? Limited access to AAC. That's another talk I could give, but my son used AAC before there were iPads. Can you believe that? Right? And trying to get him a $5,000 AAC device it's a whole nother talk in and of itself. Everyday sensory aversives, so things like fire alarms, fluorescent lights, heavy perfumes, tags and shirts, all of that can be sensory nightmares for some of us. And I put myself in that category because I'm a delicate flower when it comes to the sensory environment. We've done some of the work that we did in the classroom, looking at peer interaction. In just limited slices, we saw disabled students, autistic students, experience direct mocking, even in the presence of teachers or paraprofessionals that went unchecked. Sometimes the paraprofessional even joined in the laughing with the peers, maybe out of awkwardness or they didn't know what to do. I'm not assuming it was out of meanness, but sometimes the impact can be the same. Limited peer interactions, a lot of physical control by staff, and privileging of speech and language, prioritizing the need to speak. And then all this can lead to internalized ableism by the individual, to think they're less than or they don't deserve better. I worked with an autistic artist to create an image of what it might be like to be disabled in a school-based setting. And these are some of the messages that we came up with that students hear and are exposed to on a regular basis. Bottom line, how's all this changed my research is to really focus on the environment more when I'm studying outcomes as opposed to what's intrinsic to the individual. And a little disclaimer, that's where it went clinically too, right? Looking at how can we change the environment, not just supporting the individual's skill development. Not that that's not important, but you got to have an environment that's going to support you either way. I'd often tell my son's educators, and I always threw them off a little bit, but remember me, direct, and a little bit outside the box from the get-go, the blue hair and all that. But I'd say to him in IEP meetings, I'm like, my son's weird. My son's always going to be weird. Your job is not to make my son not weird. And they were very taken aback by that. But I just wanted to get that out of there. I said, what I want you to do is help me make an environment where he can be weird. How do we do that together?